So good evening, and thank you very much for joining us. For those of you who do not know me, I am Joan Gallagher, and I am co-facilitating this evening with Margaret Gagliardi. It is good to have the Sisters of St. Dominic and the Sisters of St. Joseph collaborating on such programs. And so we give a very special welcome to Richard, or as many know him as Dick Kubek, who is the Community Outreach Coordinator for Long Island Jobs with Justice. And he also facilitates the AMOS project, which is the Interfaith Campaign for Workers' Rights and Economic Justice. And unfortunately, Adrienne Esposito had an unexpected change in her calendar. However, she graciously gave us a wonderful next person to come. And so we're very happy to welcome Maureen Dolan Murphy, who will be filling in for her. And Maureen is the Executive Programs Manager at Citizens Campaign for the Environment. And she brings to the conversation many years of advocating for environmental justice. So we give a special welcome to Dick and Maureen. And so this evening, as we gather to listen to the cries of the poor and the cries of earth, we want to first remember those who have been crying out for hundreds of years, the indigenous of Long Island. And we want to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral and unceded land of the traditional tribes, 13 in all, that existed on Paumanok, or as we now call it, Long Island, before the European settlers came. And so remembering all those tribes, and in particularly the Shinnecock and Unkachang, who are still with us, and may their spirit be with us this evening. Welcome, Maureen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Maureen Murphy with Citizens Campaign for the Environment. I have a couple of slides that I'm going to share with you. I've been doing this work now for 22 years. And I've been working on renewable energy probably for the last 15 years. So I really want to just focus in on the biggest threat that is facing Long Island, both our environment and our communities, and that is climate change. So in the United Nations, they came out with a new report in 2023, and this report was very clear that climate change is being caused unequivocally by human actions, by human activities. And I pulled this map, and it's just a heat map showing you, we used to call it global warming, but it's not only global warming, we're actually seeing global cooling in places. So that's why we call it climate change now. But we are seeing these record warm temperatures throughout much of the globe. And we have, a lot of impacts, especially here being on Long Island. We are surrounded by water. We have the Long Island Sound, we have the Peconic Estuary, we have the Atlantic Ocean, and we have the South Shore Estuary Reserve. So we kind of jut out into the Atlantic Ocean, and we have all of these water bodies surrounding us. And we have been seeing the impacts on climate change on Long Island for quite some time. And according to NOAA, they just released this new report that since January, so from January to August of 2023, throughout the nation, there have been 23 severe weather events that have exceeded $1 billion in damage for each of those events. New York, in a short time from 2010 to 2020, we've experienced 31 extreme weather events, costing our state over $100 billion in damages. And when I talk about these extreme weather events, I'm talking about impacts that are really felt in our communities, that are really felt throughout, Long Island. We had one storm several years ago where there was at least 6 tornadoes that touched down on Long Island. We don't live in Tornado Alley. We're not supposed to get tornadoes, but yet here we are with 6 tornadoes touching down. And what does that mean for communities? What does that mean for real people? It means home damages. I mean, here's a picture. This was taken in Levittown where a tree fell on the house. And luckily, nobody was in the house at this time, but obviously extensive damage to the home. We didn't get hit by Hurricane Ida, but we did have the remnants of Hurricane Ida in September of 2021. That caused a lot of flooding here on Long Island. It also caused a lot of flooding in Queens, where at least 8 people died. And they died because the floodwaters came so fast that they were in basement apartments and could not leave. They were literally trapped in their apartment. So again, these impacts, yes, they're impacting the environment, but they're also impacting us and the community and the people who live here. In Port Washington, this was again with the Hurricane Ida remnants. We saw mudslides in Port Washington. I mean, again, this is stuff that you read that happens in California or other communities. We don't see mudslides on Long Island, but yet this road was closed because of mudslides and extensive damage. And I know that we all remember Superstorm Sandy. You know, we're coming close to the anniversary of Superstorm Sandy, and it's hard to forget this event and the damage that really wrecked the South Shore of Long Island. These pictures are taken from South Shore communities here around the island. We're just, you know, fully devastated. And then the aftermath, you know, thinking about these extreme weather events and the toll that they take on communities. And it's not just damage to our roads, to our infrastructure. I mean, Superstorm Sandy shut down our sewage treatment plant. The sewage treatment plant that treats 40% of Nassau County sewage was completely shut down. And, you know, Bay Park, those homes around Bay Park had sewage backing up into their homes and into their basements because there was total failure at the plant. When they finally recognized what was happening, they just started pumping raw sewage into the bay. So over 8 million gallons of raw sewage was pumped into the bay during Superstorm Sandy. But here I clipped this article from the Long Beach Herald, just talking about like the impact it is to the communities. And really here you can start to see the divide, right? If you're somebody wealthy enough and you live in Long Beach and your home was devastated, you tap into your money and you write a bunch of checks and you rebuild your home, and you can move out and you can stay in hotels while your home is being rebuilt. But if you're not, if you don't have that kind of money, and if you're in, you know, working class Long Island, which many of Long Islanders are, you end up living in these homes and living in these structures that are really destroyed. They're not healthy to live in. They're growing mold. You're waiting for assistance from FEMA or from the state that may be, you know, taking so long. There's so much red tape to go through. And here you could just see this person talks about many are unable to pay for out-of-pocket repairs. So what do? They just walk away. And a lot of people did, right? A lot of people just walked away from the community. So, you know, then we start to say, all right, well, you have to raise your homes. So what's the cost of that? You know, if you're living in these South Shore communities and you're being flooded and we have these increasing storms because of climate change, you have to raise your home. And these estimates, you know, $40,000 to $200,000 are specific to Long Island here and really came from that storm, Superstorm Sandy. So it is not cheap to raise your home. And again, here you are. If you have the money, that's great. You could do it. But what happens if you don't? There's also this added layer of insurance for many people that live in these south-lying communities, these, you know, disadvantaged communities that feel the brunt of the storms and the brunt of these climate impacts. Insurance companies are pulling out. They're pulling out nationwide and they're pulling out across Long Island as well. So we see flood insurance going up if you're lucky to get insurance. So this was a quick Google search I did this afternoon, and here's the top stories that come up when you Google this topic. And It's pretty hard to forget the orange skies that we saw this summer. So it's not just, damage in dollars, but it's health damages as well. We were all impacted here because of Canada wildfires. 27 million acres burned in Canada last year. And that air came down and impacted our communities. There was, mandates to wear masks again outside. There was mandates to stay inside. Events were canceled. And people that had health impacts to start with were really the people that were impacted here as well. I'm just going to skip because I know we don't have a lot of time, but, we're seeing impacts, of course, to our estuaries, to our local economies, like Peconic scallops that are seeing the impacts of warming temperatures and warming bay temperatures, and they just cannot survive. So what do we need to do? We need to transition the way we produce energy. And I use this picture, which is of Northport Power Plant, because right now Long Island is very dependent on fossil fuel power plants. We have Port Jefferson, we have E.F. Barrett in Island Park, we have Northport Power Plant, and they provide about 40% of our generation. And again, these are fossil fuel power plants. And the cost of oil keeps going up. Yesterday, oil closed at $91 a barrel. And those impacts trickle down, right? We see it at the pump. We see it for now coming into the winter for home heating oil. We see it in prices of grocery stores. Anything that we buy is impacted here by the cost of oil going up, because then shipping goes up as well. And why is oil going up? Well, because Russia and Saudi Arabia got together and they said, we don't want it to go down. People are actually using less oil, so we need to keep the price high to make sure we're making money. And they have worked together to have supply cuts. And those supply cuts are meant to keep prices high. There's a community in Astoria, Queens. It's called Asthma Alley. I just use this because here is a population that lives around these gigantic fossil fuel power plants that really have these high levels of asthma and health problems. And this is a good news story, and we're going to get to the good news right now in my last few minutes here. I have 5 minutes left. Yesterday, the governor came down and she did a ribbon cutting that will bring a new renewable energy project using hydroelectric power to that area. So to be able to replace fossil fuel infrastructure with clean, renewable energy. And that's what we really have to do, right? We have to start embracing renewable energy, changing the way we produce energy, fighting climate change, pushing back against using fossil fuel energies. We need to look at things like large-scale solar projects, which we're very lucky here on Long Island. There are, several large-scale solar projects, both in parking lots. I know the Sisters of St. Joseph, you have a large-scale solar project on your property. I have solar on my house. So we need to do more solar. And we also need to do more with offshore wind. We are really lagging behind Europe in offshore wind. Here in the United States, we have one operational offshore wind farm. It's a very small offshore wind farm off the coast of Rhode Island that provides electricity to the Block Island community. But here in New York, we have big goals. And we have really, said, all right, we're going to fight back on climate change. We're going to invest in large-scale renewables. That's going to include offshore wind. And as part of those goals, we have committed to 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind. And some of those projects are under construction. The South Fork offshore wind farm, the infrastructure is actually laid and done in the ground. All of the cable infrastructure has been laid, is finished. They actually put the foundations into the water. And now the last part is they have to put the turbine on top of the foundation. So we are moving along. This is just like a quick snapshot of the offshore wind projects that are moving forward in New York. We have Empire Wind 1, Empire Wind 2, the South Fork one, which is a small one, but that is, the furthest along. We have Beacon Wind and we have Sunrise Wind. And here's just kind of to give you a high level view of how much power and how large these offshore wind farms will be. So you'll see many of them. The South Fork is a smaller one. It's only 130 megawatts, so it's enough for about 70,000 homes. But the other ones are much bigger with power that can help up to 500, 600,000 homes here on Long Island and in New York City. So I like to end on this slide because it's not too late to act. And we need people to show up, stand up, and speak up. And New York has done a lot to, push the needle and to fight back on climate change with its goals on offshore wind, with its goals on solar power. But now we need to make sure that gets implemented and that gets done. And we right now are in a battle. There is a small group of very loud voices, particularly in the South Shore of Nassau County, where we're going to have one of the offshore wind turbines connect into the grid. And they don't want it. And they have been spreading a lot of misinformation and, just making up stuff, honestly, about these offshore wind turbines. And we need to fight back. We need to fight back with facts, but we need to fight back with our voices. So we don't let the small group of naysayers drive the agenda. We want to drive the agenda. And we want New York to invest in more offshore wind. But New York right now is very quiet because, there is a lot of pushback. So we need to make sure that we're out there and we're saying we want these projects, we support these projects, and we want to move forward in fighting climate change because there is no other option. We're at a place where really there is no option. We're feeling the impacts of climate change now, and it only will worsen with our reliance on fossil fuels. So I know that's my 15 minutes, so I'm going to wrap up. And I know we'll have lots of time for discussion later. Thank you.
Maureen, thank you so much for that clear, focused, really presentation. Let's just take a minute and let's let what Maureen said sink in. So holding that, we want to listen to what Dick has to say. Joan introduced Dick. In fact, he needs no introduction for so many of us. He has been a presence on Long Island. The work that he has facilitated, that he has done is outstanding. It would take the whole call to go through it. So Dick, you're going to help us understand a little bit about the needs of people who are poor on Long Island.
Sure. Thank you, Sister, for the invite, Sister Joan as well. And thank you all for coming. I'm actually going to wear 3 hats tonight. In addition to Long Island Jobs with Justice and their Amos project, I chair the Welfare to Work Commission of the Suffolk County Legislature. And I'm also chair of Abraham's Table of Long Island. We bring together Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others to find common values, common traditions, common purpose. When I was chair of Welfare to Work a couple of years ago, former presiding officer of the legislature, we were holding hearings on poverty, and Dwayne Gregory told us the story. He had gotten a soccer scholarship to go to one of the Carolina prestigious universities, and his team members said, "Why do you need a scholarship? You're from Long Island. Everybody's rich. Why are you taking up somebody else's scholarship?" And he had to persuade them that he is not rich and everyone on Long Island is not rich. And when you look at us, from bird's eye view, we're rich. Our Nassau County median of household income is almost $137,000 for a family of four. In Suffolk, it's almost 20,000. The country, just to give you context, the median family income is 74,580. Whoa, it's almost double. So we look rich. When you look at our poverty rate, we look okay. The national poverty rate is about 11%. We're at about 5.8%. Whoa, we're doing really well. Well, the truth is we're not doing really well because we're a very high income area, a high cost of living area. And the Welfare at Work Commission released last December a report on poverty in Suffolk County and also Nassau County. We did this with 87 witnesses, 11 hours of public testimony, 4 focus groups, a lot of written testimony. And we looked at 2 independent studies of what it costs to live on Long Island, and they both came up with the same figures. Astounding. You ready? For a family of 4 to pay for basic necessities, it takes about $100,000. And they concluded that if you're earning around $80,000, you're barely surviving. Whoa. But the federal poverty definition for the entire country, except for Hawaii and Alaska, is $29,678. Now, keep in mind that numbers are boring, but try to stay focused on the fact it takes about $100,000 to pay for your bills on Long Island. The federal government says if you're earning $29,000, you're poor. That is, if you're earning $30,000, you're not poor. And that becomes a threshold for defining who's going to get supportive services to get by. So food stamps, eligibility, they don't look at the 80,000 or the 100,000. Are you earning 29,000? If you're over that, well, maybe you can't get the food stamps. Maybe you can't get Medicaid. Maybe you can't get childcare subsidies. So this is a critical number. It is very, very critical. And when you look at the folks who are poor, again, 29,000, we only have 6%. Our commission, in our report last year, and we did a report 10 years ago also, said you have to double the federal poverty level. So the true poverty level with our cost of living is 60,000. In which case, for a family of 4, in which case, the poverty level for Long Island jumps from 6% to 20%. That's a lot of people. And when you look at the people who are just barely getting by, 80,000 or less, you're talking about almost 300,000 people who are barely paying their bills. So what are their challenges? So, Sister Joan, if you could put up the first of the screen shares, which is the Poverty Conference outline, the one-pager. So Abraham's Table and the Poor People's Campaign on December 15th are going to co-sponsor a conference, and appropriately titled "Don't Blame Poor People." We'll get to that in a moment. If you want to look at the challenges, they're in our workshops, they're in the breakouts. So these are the breakouts we're going to offer. These are the challenges that we reported in the Welfare at Work report. The breakouts closely follow our chapters, in fact. Racism and housing and educational segregation, major challenge. Stereotyping the poor, I'll get back to that. Environmental destruction, the lack of affordable quality childcare, broken criminal justice systems, particularly burdening people of color. Disparities in healthcare, also people in color are burdened. Military spending and taking from poverty programs. Low wages, stolen wages, union busting. The critical shortage of affordable housing and broken immigration laws. These are the structural issues that are keeping, well, almost 300,000 people poor. And again, the definition of poverty can't be the federal definition. It's way too low. So what's our challenge? Go back and see everybody. I'm going to throw this challenge out to you as people of faith. And that challenge, I'm going to say, is yes, structural. We need to look at those particular barriers, whether it's housing or healthcare. But there's another challenge, and it's attitudinal. And as people of faith, we are positioned to question the attitudes that keep people poor. Yes, attitudes that create the structures that keep people poor. What am I talking about? I'm talking about our obsession with work and individualism. I'm talking about the Puritan ethic. I'm talking about a distortion of Calvinism that the Calvinists believe Calvin believed that an all-knowing God knows who's going to be saved and who's not going to be saved, who's predestined. And as the Massachusetts and other New England colonies became settled and wealthy, they began to question, am I among the elect? Am I saved? What are the signs? And they looked at their work ethic and they said, I guess if you're rich, you're saved because you worked hard. And if you're poor, you're among the damned. This, by the way, is not my theory. Any number of economic historians have looked at this and said, this is the root of the attitudes in this country that make it really tough for poor people to get the help they need and to get out of poverty. The belief that rich people are the elect and poor people are the damned. They've done something wrong. They're lazy. They're irresponsible. So when you look, for example, at the so-called Welfare Reform Act, President Clinton called it one of the greatest reforms since the New Deal, 1997. What was it called? The Work Opportunity and Personal Responsibility Act. That is, poor people don't want to work and they're irresponsible. The preface to that bill actually said, the purpose of the welfare reform is to reduce illegitimate pregnancies. What? What are we talking about? And what the law did was it said, because people are lazy, we will make them work. And if they don't want to work, we will sanction them, we'll punish them, we'll reduce their benefits. And they will only have 5 years to stay on welfare. And it was an amazing success. 60% of the cases in America were closed. By the way, this is despite the fact that right before welfare reform, a study was done that showed half of the women on welfare were working. But the belief was they're lazy, they don't want to work, so make them work. So the 60% of the cases have closed, but poverty hasn't gone down. These folks have been pushed out because they're believed to have been lazy. We fixed that. We made them go to work, but they're working at poverty wages. They're among those 300,000 we were talking about, and they recycle back onto welfare. So the challenge is going to be for you and for me and for all of us. How do we break through the stereotype? And I'm telling you, the stereotype penetrates our public policies. So, when you talk about, I was listening the other day, there are certain states that say, if you're going to get Medicaid, you have to work. Well, wait, you could be sick. Doesn't matter. You have to work. If you want food stamps, you have to work. How do we, you and I, how do we break through that? So we've developed a toolkit at Abraham's table. And Sister Joan, if you could bring up Preach Good News to the Poor. This toolkit was distributed to you. We did a training in June. Almost 60 people came to it. We're encouraging folks to use this toolkit to help Long Island faith leaders address poverty between October 17th, which is the UN Day of Poor, of ending poverty, and November 17th, which is Pope Francis's World Day of the Poor. Let's just scroll down. I'll show you what's in here. So what can you do? Well, one of the things you can do is get your liturgical experience, your masses, to begin to focus on the poor. And we give you ways to do that. Keep going, Joe. We're going to scroll down. So keep going. So we have in this, keep going. So we have scriptural references, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, Unitarian. We have prayers for the poor. We have petitions. Hold on here. We have petitions that you can work into, let's say it's November 17th, or maybe it's November 19th, the World Day of the Poor, where you have petitions taken from the Welfare to Work report. For example, for the almost 200,000 Long Islanders living below the federal poverty level and the additional 268,000 households who still cannot make ends meet, Lord, hear our prayer. So these are actual statistics from Long Island that you can work into your Mass on Pope Francis's World Day of the Poor. Keep going, Joan. Going to go down to the with prayers for just. Okay, so at the end we have activities, and if you can go to page 11, give you some examples. So one of the things we suggest you do a little further down. One of the things, yeah, okay, stop. We give you here a link. So you see there's the Suffolk SWTW poverty report. If you click on that, that will take you directly to the poverty report I've been referencing. It's 100 and something pages long. If you go down to the next one, you can go to the Poor People's Campaign New York State poverty report. But if you go to number 3, Joan, and click here on number 3, giving you a hard time here, right? Is the link going to work? Not working? Well, that happens.
This is what came up.
Did something come up? No, that's too bad. Okay. Well, that link would take you to a PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint will walk you through the welfare to work report, and there you will go through the various structures. So we will examine, for example, how serious is the lack of affordable housing? You know, what's the issue that to afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment, you have to earn over $100,000 to purchase the median house cost, which is about $550,000. You should be earning almost $200,000. What happens to the people not earning $200,000? They're never going to own a home. What happens to people who are earning $80,000? Where are you going to find an apartment? So that's just a couple of the slides, but we look at childcare, we look at wages, we look at the healthcare inequities, and that is a PowerPoint that you can use to create a discussion in your congregation. The other thing that we have, we go down to the next page, page 12. One more page. Okay, so you see number, hold on. See number, what, just up a little bit. Sorry about this, Joe. There you go. Okay, so number 5. Let's see if the link works here. You want to try it? Yeah, the links are not working. Okay, the links are going to work for you. I don't know why they're not working here, but if you clicked on 5, you would see that we've taken the major facts about poverty in Nassau and Suffolk County, and we put them into bulletin inserts, which you can run in the weeks leading up to, let's say you're going to do the World Day of Poor in November. You could publish one per week on childcare issues, another one on housing, another one on healthcare inequities. And then the last thing we suggest is that you get involved in some advocacy group that's doing something. Now, yes, I'm going to say Long Island Jobs with Justice is one of them. We have links on how you can get involved with us. I'll just give you a couple of issues we're working on now. One of them is we're working with wage theft, particularly for immigrants who are told they're going to be paid a certain amount of money, they're not paid. That's one issue. We're also looking at workers who are excluded from unemployment insurance and how we can get them help. And most recently, and many of you signed on, we had a faith letter, 165 signatures, many of you on the call tonight, to allow asylum seekers to enter Nassau and Suffolk, despite the attempts by certain government officials to stop them. We were just at the Nassau legislature this week, reminding them of what our call is. So, and the other connection we give you is the Poor People's Campaign. You can get involved with them too. So, so I've given you some thoughts and ideas. You can go back. I can see everybody. I will conclude just in time by saying that Long Island Jobs with Justice is particularly grateful to all of the work that the sisters have done. And that's why I'm so happy to be here tonight. You are real partners. You get the special role that the church can play in charity. You're doing it, and also advocating for justice, going after those structures, whether it's the lack of housing or inequitable health care or the lack of childcare. You're already there. I think the challenge is to take our toolkit and get it into your parishes where you worship. Get them to preach on November 19th about poverty. Get them to publish the inserts. Get them to have a discussion. Get them to partner with other congregations to have a discussion. So that's the challenge. Those are the tools, and my time is up.
Wow, Dick, thank you. Thank you very much. Again, let's just take a minute to sit with this. So before we give the sisters a chance to go into breakout rooms, I'd like to ask the both of you, Dick and Maureen, how would you articulate the driving factors of what both of you are talking about in terms of the situation on Long Island? Like, what we have all these problems. What's underneath keeping the problems going, keeps feeding them, keeps them alive? We'd love to hear you talk to each other for a bit about that.
Sure. And I just wanted to say, I took some notes, Richard, while you were talking. And even though the topics that we talked on might have sounded very different, they really weren't. Because you were talking about the challenges. How do we break through the stereotypes? And, part of what we're doing here at CCE is, how do we break through the misinformation, right? How do we get that fact-based information out there? How do we get people engaged and involved to fight this and tackle this? Because we have the tools to do this. We have the tools to fight climate change. We have the tools to fight poverty. How do we get that information out there and get the people engaged and active enough to do that? So even though we were talking about what might have sounded very different, I felt like underneath we were both saying the same thing. And you had some, great hands-on ways to really fight back. I call it fight back, but really to get the information out there, to, put it in your prayers, to put it in your church bulletin, to disseminate that information to churchgoers and to the congregation. And here at CCE, we look to do the same things, even if it's on a different platform. Get the facts on social media, send it out through email action alerts, develop literature that people can then use and bring with them and give to their neighbors. So I think that's really important as we move forward, and to be able to do that through our different channels. And all of you are connected to channels, and to be kind of that web of information that you can disseminate. I think that's so important.
Yeah, I agree with you, Maureen. And I think the commonality, which is a barrier to getting ecological reform and also to ending poverty, is that mindset, particularly here on Long Island, that we are rich, and that all that matters is that I maintain my wealth, and that my property be protected, and that no one tell me what to do with it. And then you layer onto that all of the stereotypes. And so these people who are lazy should not be near me, because they'll drag down my stereotypes, my property value, or they'll add to my tax base, which is another challenge you face. I ain't paying for this. But essentially, what the church offers, and we're talking to a faith group tonight, and at Abraham's table, we do this all the time, whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Unitarian, there's that sense of community, that you're part of something bigger than your quarter acre and your picket fence. And it's that notion that you're not part of something bigger that prevents ecological reform, and it prevents efforts to do what we're called to do, to help people who are in need. And surprisingly, as I pointed out, with all of those numbers, behind every number, there's a person and a family. We have a lot more of them than we'd like to admit, people who are struggling. Again, 300,000 households, not people, households struggling. But that's the commonality, Maureen. That's it. It's all about me and not about the community.
And, when you said part of something bigger, right? That really connects, because a lot of times when we go out into communities, and especially when I'll just use offshore wind because that's what I was talking about, but we, talk about offshore wind, and we have people say, I support renewable energy. I support offshore wind, just not here.
Right.
Just not, don't run the cable on that street next to my house. And, you know, that is, you have to recognize that you are part of something bigger. So we can't just say, I support it, but it's just not here. We all have to, you know, come together and recognize that fighting climate change is a big thing to do. And no, it's not going to be perfect. Nothing ever is perfect, right? We wish that everything could be perfect, but nothing is going to be perfect. But we have to make it the least environmental impact or the least environmental burdensome that we can.
Yeah. So if you look at the, if we go back to the 10 workshops that we're going to offer at the conference, I was thinking, like, which would be the most serious problem? To speak for a moment like a social worker, you know, what's the presenting problem people face who are struggling? It would be the lack of housing. And so just what you found, the last survey I looked at, Long Islanders now, about 70% see the need for affordable housing. Whoa, I've been doing this for 20 years. That's a big change, an openness. They're seeing their kids leave, for example, and, you know, going to the Carolinas and you have to travel 10 hours to see your grandchildren. However, so 70% see the need, 63% said, but I don't want it in my neighborhood. And there you go. We can have offshore wind, but don't send the cable into Long Beach, please. Send it into a poor neighborhood. They don't care.
Right.
Which very often happens, by the way. I wonder if the two of you might take a stab at addressing what shall I say? I mean, you're talking about not my backyard. The other kind of saying is, don't bring me no bad news, right? And a lot of what we bring to people in terms of the issues we're talking about, there's no receptivity to hear the issues, the truth of the issues. I wonder if you would speak to that a little bit. How do you make people, how do you invite people to listen to something that they might not find too agreeable?
Well, I think there's a lot of ways to do that, you know, and part of it is not giving up. I mean, frankly, just to keep drumming the drum beat, you know, and if they start to see it in different ways and in different forums, then they might be more receptive to it. So just because you start talking about something and it's not warmly embraced from the onset, to not give up, to not drop that message, because that message is still important. And sometimes people just need to hear something 2 or 3 or 4 times before they start to process it.
I have a 2-part answer to that. One is to appeal to their self-interest, to say, if we don't get affordable housing, your kids are going to have to move off the island. If we don't close the educational disparity between Half Hollow Hills, where I live, 98% of the kids graduate from high school, and Wyandanch, right next to me, contiguous, where 50% graduate, and the other 50%, many wind up in the pipeline to prison. And so we talk in our report, and I've done this in public settings, about, you know, spending $500 a night to put a person into the Suffolk County Jail. Ka-ching, ka-ching, when you add up the number of people in the jail, that becomes something like $900,000 a month. It's crazy. So that's one way to do it. But since we're a faith group and Abraham's Table, which is sponsoring the conference, and the Poor People's Campaign, which is called for moral renewal, I would say, let's go to Catholic social teaching. Let's go to Matthew 25. Let's go to Isaiah. Let's go back to our scriptural roots, so our teachings, and let's get our priests and our deacons and you know, whoever is organizing our masses to talk about this stuff. And I know how hard that is, and I know they're not going to want to do it because they don't want to talk about bad news, as you framed it. But you know, if each of our people tonight, each of our sisters, becomes a lobbyist to get this done, just in November, to do the Day of the Poor, to have those petitions, to have a discussion group, so that this becomes on the agenda of every parish. That's another way to do this, because we are positioned to bring about change. We are, as people of faith.
Thank you. Good.
Great. So we have Elizabeth Kelm and Karen Kalin, who would like to respond in terms of what they heard from Adrienne, and then again in conversation with their small group, so that you could add your insights to the conversation. So Elizabeth, I'll invite you first.
Okay, thank you. I had an interesting juxtaposition of I'm responding to the cry of the earth. We did a lot of talk about the cry of the poor in our group. And the thing that strikes me about this is, well, there are two things that strike me about this. One of them is, and just to say this for myself, is that I think about Thomas Berry's famous saying about the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. And I think that covers both areas completely, because when we objectify the earth, we get the mess that we're in now. And when we objectify the poor, their suffering grows. So it's the same principle, applying the same principle to both realities. I was very struck by that. And the other thing I was very struck by too, which I think ties in, I know there, in terms of this is two women's congregations talking together, is that women religious are really on the forefront of both of these issues and are addressing them in ways that, somebody said in my group that, and I had written it down, it's great we can get these inserts into the bulletins. We've done it before. It's very helpful, but I don't know if the priests will talk about it. And that's a reality when you look at Laudato Si. Many, not all parishes, but many parishes are not really addressing what is happening to the earth. I wrote down when Margaret said that this presentation was clear, focused. It was a wow, and the word that came to me was reality. It was very real about what's happening, and the question is, to me, that what we're all discussing is, how do we make this reality real to other people, that they understand it, that they will move forward? Because there's a similar dynamic going on in both places. I don't want these windmills blocking my line of vision of the ocean. I don't want these poor people in my neighborhood. It's a very similar phenomenon, I think. And if you are one of the lucky people that are living, with access to whatever you want, you don't want to give that up. You want to keep using it no matter what the cost is. And if you are one of those people that has plenty of money to live, you don't want anybody changing the way you get that money. So they're really the same dynamic going on at the same time, and they lead us down to the same path of the lack of love for the created, natural, beautiful world we've been given to us, that as it's destroyed, it impacts on everybody, but primarily the poor. And then if we are not loving the most needy and the poorest among us, we not only lessen them, we lessen ourselves at the same time. So I really see that the deep connection between these two topics. I heard the connection in the way it was presented to us. It was very real to me. And I think women religious are part of the answer. I do believe that, from what I heard and from what I've experienced myself. And if I can just take one little second to say, because
1 second.
And 1 second, I've seen climate change at our farm and how it's impacted us. It's very real to me. But unless you're somebody who's had a storm that has wrecked your house, you can pretend it's not happening.
Thank you, Elizabeth. You were very clear and concise as well. And it is true that it's just one cry. It's one and the same for sure.
cry.
And let me just say that even though we are talking about two congregations of women religious on Long Island, we are joined by our associates, our partners in
Yes,
mission,
of course.
because without them, we couldn't do it. So thank you very much for your response. And Karen, we'll turn to you now.
And so just looking at what Maureen has said and our own reactions to it. Maureen, when you said so concisely, show up, stand up, speak up, that really hit us. It's like, yes, okay, it's giving us very briefly what we need to do. We need to use our voice. We need to give the support to what we are, what we see. And one of the common things, and we were talking about in the small group, we were really looking at, yes, in that using of our voice, it's the information. We need to keep giving the correct information, because here in New York State, we are doing a lot. We have a lot of good plans, and we have a lot of pushback, which is quite organized, especially with the wind farms. And we're just beginning to do those projects. And the not in my backyard, the insularity. So we were looking at the underlying dynamic of fear. How is this going to affect myself, my yard, my community, which on Long Island is quite segregated? So we need to keep with the voice of, yes, we all want this. It's for the good of all. We're going to sink literally here on Long Island without taking the measures that we need. So it is that information. And I see my time is up.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both, Elizabeth and Karen. And now we're going to invite Kathy Hickey and Emily Massey to respond again to what they heard from Dick or what they heard in their small groups, the cries of the poor, which we also know are also the cries of the earth. And so, Kathy, would you like to begin?
Sure. I want to top off what they were saying by briefly about climate change and about how it's impacting us by saying that I am a frequent board walker at Jones Beach. And it's gentler on my old bones. But I get down there to walk my 2 miles. And about 2 weeks ago, I went down and a good part of Jones Beach was underwater, which I hadn't seen since Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy. And that was from Franklin, which was several hundred miles offshore. Field 6 was gone. Field 3 was gone. Actually, I was there recently. Field 3 is still gone. So, people, it's not that people don't see it. It's connecting the dots once again. But getting to my response to Dick. Dick, I guess I was playing with one of the things that you were mentioning in terms of how do you get people on board? How do you get them to connect the dots? And you were talking about, moving them by talking about their own self-interest. I think Karen was referring to that also. And I think that's probably key in many respects to get people to move. How's this impacting me? I read Newsday, I guess it was maybe about a week ago, and they were talking about Southampton. And in Southampton, they are really, their roads are really just clogged. They're in gridlock at points. And part of the problem that they identified is this is happening because there's no housing there. So the people that serve the larger community of Southampton can't live in Southampton, so they have to commute there. So, I'm saying to myself as I'm reading this, are other people reading this and connecting the dots? Are they connecting the dots to such an extent that you really have to start then to think about, well, I guess we really do have to create affordable housing, workforce housing, however you want to term it. And, it amazes me that I see this time and time again, and I'm saying, aren't they connecting the dots yet? And I was saying to the group that I was in, that in the initial stages of the pandemic, I was working in an outreach program in Queens Village. And in that outreach program, we had a very large food pantry that covered 5 zip codes. And one of the things that happened about, I would say, 2 weeks into the shutdown were just the numbers of people that were coming because we stayed open throughout it. The numbers of people that came to us saying, I never thought this would happen to me.
Mm-hmm.
I had a job. I don't have a job anymore. And person after person, they were in absolute shock. And it's only then that I think that they began to connect the dots that, yes, we're all vulnerable and we all need each other. And on the other end of it were the people who called up to do whatever they needed to do, whatever they thought they could afford to do, because they all knew somebody that had lost their jobs. It could have been their siblings, it could have been their kids, it could have been whoever. But they knew it was happening. And so the dots were being connected. And I think that probably one of the things that we need to focus on, certainly Catholic social teaching, but maybe even before that, what is the common good? On Long Island, people are such individuals with their quarter acre, their picket fence, their lawns, they pay their taxes, and this is what they expect, and nothing else. So when do you start to connect the dots and try to move them? At least, are we a community here? Is there a common good that needs to be achieved? And maybe that's the route or the initial steps to go in these instances.
Thanks, Kathy.
Sure.
Okay, we can wrap it up. Great, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in a short time, and I know we can go on, but we can keep it focused because there will be follow-up to this for sure. So thank you for those points. And Emily, if you could unmute yourself, and then we'll give you your 2 minutes to respond, please.
Okay. I think, Dick gave us facts, which maybe objectively we were aware of, but that they became more real for us. And so I think that was a good thing for us. We in our congregation have been working on the Laudato Si action platform, but the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, and ecological environment are so connected. And I think all of that came to us tonight. One of the other things Dick mentioned, and it came out in our group, it's the attitudes of people, that if we could, help move people from me or Martin Buber, I to thou kind of thing. Dick alluded to it in our chat group, but, that people disconnect, and especially we Christians, what Jesus teaches us, and going to church, that we go to church just to pray, be by myself, and have nothing. But yet the message of Jesus is a disturbing message, and that we should not be afraid to hear it. And I think, given what we learned tonight about the lack of good housing for the people, the attitudes people on Nassau, Suffolk, and in New York City about the asylum keepers, that we are on brother's keeper. And so that is something then with this coming weeks of prayer for the poor and poverty, that we use the prayers, try to do our best to make them more public, from the toolkit, the poverty toolkit, whose name I forget, but it's here. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily and Kathy and Karen and Elizabeth. And yes, we will follow up with this, and you will all receive again all of that information as well. So not to worry. Okay, and so we would invite now Dick and Maureen, if you have anything else to add, and then Margaret will wrap us up.
Sure, Dick, you want to go first?
Okay. So when I was at Catholic Charities for 13 years, I did a lot of work with the Reverend Tom Goodhue. Some of you may remember him, who's the executive director of the Long Island Council of Churches. And he used to say that people of faith, when they're confronted with a social problem, very often wring their hands and they say, "Ain't it awful? Let us pray." And they don't go beyond that. And so I know that speaking to the sisters, you go way beyond that. As somebody said it earlier, you're out there, you're cutting edge. But I'm going to urge you to take your passion into the whatever parish you worship at, and speak to the pastor and try to get something going between October 17th, the UN Day of Ending Poverty, and Pope Francis, November 19th, and use the toolkit to become a lobbyist for justice and say, "Father, we got to do this." And I do really appreciate so much of what you do. You really are. You're pioneers and you're our allies.
And I just want to say, thank you again. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for this lively discussion. I loved hearing your reactions. I wish that all presentations ended with a summary of reactions, because it really was my favorite part. And, one of the reactions, somebody said, the underlying dynamic is fear. And people are afraid of what they don't know. And time again, no matter what topic it is, people are afraid of what they don't know. And that's why it's so important to be able to use our voices and to be able to, push out the facts and the information. And I'm glad that, show up, stand up, and speak up really resonated with you, because that's what you're doing all the time on a multitude of issues. And it's so important that we use our voices and that our voices get through. And, whether it's the voices even in a small group of people, but that small group then becomes a large group of people. And it trickles up the chain all the way up to our elected officials and, the heads of our state that really make these driving policy changes that are better for our earth and our poor. So thank you again for having me. It's been a wonderful experience.
Great. And Margaret, if you could unmute Margaret, and then we'll have you wrap it up.
Thank you both so much for all that you've offered to us tonight. And thank you, everyone, really, for the way you've participated in this call. As I'm listening to this, I feel like both Dick and Maureen helped us to reweave the web of life here on Long Island. Long Island is our home. We love the island, and I think that the stakes for life on the island are higher than they've ever been. And we thank you really for the challenge. When Joan and I and others planned this call, we saw this as a beginning, as a way to figure out how the two congregations might be able to work together more effectively in speaking to some of these issues. And I think you've given us some real concrete ways that we might look at that. So I think I'd like to say to you that you have our pledge that we are going to look at this and see how we can move forward together. And thank you for all the work you've done. We're very grateful, really, to both of you, all of the organizations that you chair.